So short, who asked you to be? Cut like a teen top from 2003. I just want a sleeve with a little more grace, not a fabric spotlight on my upper arm place.
Here, we're marking where the top of the shoulder seam is. I'm doing it with a pin, but you could also do it with chalk or a little piece of tape or any way that makes you happy. I find it really helpful to keep track of the front and the back of the sleeve because they aren't exactly the same. That might surprise you if you haven't made garments before, but we need a little bit more room in the back. Now we're going to cut this old sleeve off and it's going to become our pattern. And if you cut it on the outside away from the body, then you're going to preserve as much fabric as possible, and it just makes it a little easier to put it all back together. And you're just going to cut very carefully along that seam. I find that holding it between my fingers and away from any layers underneath to make sure I don't snip them by accident works really well. Okay, so if you forgot and you accidentally cut the seam allowance off onto the side of the sleeve instead of the shirt, we're just going to fix it by making them all even. It'll be a little slightly smaller than we want it to be, but that's okay. And we're going to double the seam allowance, which would have been like a 1/4 inch. But now we're going to need 2 seam allowances added onto our sleeve. Now we're also going to measure the distance between your shoulder and however long you want your sleeve to be. My favorite hack is just to use something that's handy because I can never find my measuring tape when I need it. It also avoids any math or doing inches versus centimeters. When we're laying this out, you want to leave room for the seam allowance at the top, right? So here's me just putting that seam allowance into place so you can understand it visually. And then I'm going to measure from, the top of that seam allowance. I've added it onto my pattern down to the length of the sleeve, and we're also adding a hem. I've added a full inch hem so that I can turn it over, 1/2 inch and then 1/2 inch and have it be exactly where I want it. I like to double check that, those sleeve ends are approximately the same place. And then here's one of my hacks is I use my finger for that 1/2 inch seam allowance because my finger is about 1/2 inch. Yours is probably close to that, and you can kind of get used to whether you need it to be slightly smaller or slightly bigger. I'm also marking on my new sleeve that I'm cutting exactly where that center point that lined up with the seam is. So that's how we use the old sleeve as our pattern. Oftentimes in sewing, we use a little snip to mark where we line things up with. So I'm going to just put one of those in place so that you can see this easily later. So just a little snip where that shoulder seam goes. And you can see here when you're looking at it that there's more bulk in the back. And I'm just showing you the seam allowance. The commercial seam allowances tend to be about 1/4 inch. That's how wide they're overlapping of the fabric, that they've serged off or, overlocked or whatever. That tends to be about 1/4 inch. Now, let me show you some things about pinning this in place. First of all, you're going to press it. You knew that was coming. So we're going to iron it when we're getting ready to pin it together to make sure that it's really easy to do. Both the outsides are going to face each other. Let's do a little snip here, long enough for the seam allowance to be free. And the first pin is going to go under the arm, the second pin at the shoulder, and the third pin at the other side of the underarm. So we're going to line this up pretty exactly as we can. Okay, my next pin is going to be up at the shoulder, and I'm just following the fabric up there. And there's that little snip I told you about, and I'm sorry I'm not showing you the other side, but this is right on top of that seam line that's in the garment. And I'm putting my pin through right there, boom, to hold it. Then we're coming around to the other side of the underarm, and we're going to pin that in place. And in a second, you'll see why we do these 3 first, because usually the sleeve is bigger than the body because we need a little bit of extra fabric to go around the moving part of the arm. I like to go about 1/3 of the way up. I use my hand to sort of measure that approximately. This first third, these pieces of fabric, they might be different shapes, but they'll line up pretty exactly. They're not going to give you a ton of difficulty. And I'm going to do that on both of the bottom sides. So going up about 1/3 and lining it up. And I tend to use gravity to sort of help things line up to make sure that there's no pulling. And see, there's my little hack of just using my hand to measure. This is really an approximate measure. If you can see where the curve of the fabric changes directions, that's really the part that we're aiming for. Like if you lay that sleeve out, it kind of curves under and then it curves up over the top. And we want to find the point right before it does that. And then you'll see there's all this extra fabric sticking out. The sleeve is bigger than the body, and it's supposed to be that way. So I go about halfway through that area and I put a pin in there to evenly distribute the excess. And here you're going to see on the front piece, it's not quite as extreme, but we're still going to have more fabric on the sleeve than we do on the body. And going halfway down and putting a little pin in there. Super. Now we're ready to take it to the sewing machine. This is very exciting. One thing I always do, because I hadn't, and it bit me in the rear so many times, is I just turn things right side out to make sure that seam's on the inside. Whoops. No, it's not. So I repinned it and now we're checking. Look, it is. That's very happy. Yay! All right, we're ready to go to the sewing machine. Very exciting here. I use the seam allowance that I cut off to measure how wide my seam allowance will be. So the area from the needle to the edge of the fabric should be the same. Now I'm showing you this in fast motion, but I will put a link in my description below. So if you want more detail on how to put a set-in sleeve in, or if you've never done that before, you can do it. Now in this case, I had a little pucker, and it's okay to go in and snip any puckers you have out and take out as many stitches as you need. In this case, we're going to do what's called a mend. And we're going to overlap our previous stitch line by 1 inch before the mend, or in my case, maybe a couple fingers, and about the same amount afterwards. What we're doing is, in place of a back tack, we are overlapping the stitches, so it creates the same kind of knot so your seams won't come out. All right, and I'm able to sew over that same little area, this time, making sure that it's perfectly flat and fixing any mistakes I made. And then when we turn it right side out and look at it, oh, we can see it's so much happier, yes. Okay, here's a little hack. With lightweight fabric, sometimes my machine jams the thread into the bottom. And so I put a little piece of scrap paper underneath to stabilize, especially at the beginning and ends where I back tack. Another thing you'll see me doing here is I am releasing that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm making sure that I sew inside those areas, and I will trim off just a little bit of the white area. This sleeve is just a little tighter than the other one, so I'm compensating for it. Now we have those sleeves onto the body. We just need to sew up the underarm, that little snip that we took and the rest of that. And the first thing we're going to do is sort of line up these seam lines. And the way you line up a seam line is you go in right where the seam will be in terms of the seam allowance being a 1/4 inch. So I'm going 1/4 inch down, and I'm putting the pin right through the areas that need to line up. And in my experience, if I don't also put it back through the seam line, holding both of those in place, it does get crooked and I somehow don't get it as spot on. So I line it up both right where it's going through and a little bit down on the same seam line. And then we're going to go to the end. Oh, I guess I'm going to put a pin in here because if you are driving the sewing machine towards your seam allowance, it will force it to go the other direction. And so I'm just trying to force it to go the way I want there. That is so not important, but lining this up here is important. Okay, so I get that as exact as I can. And here is a hack moment, right? We have a little bit of seam allowance where we're going to blend it because we cut it off when we snipped that area. Now, if you are a perfectionist, instead of snipping that area, you should absolutely seam rip it, and you won't have to do this, but this is right under arm. Oh, a little rule of thumb is if you put a pin in a way that it makes it pucker, take it out and repin it. Okay, so we're gonna sew right across that. See how I've pushed that fabric up to the edge? So we're just sort of compensating for having a little bit less fabric here in this tiny area under the armpit where nobody will see it. So yes, this is a hack, but it's just such a big time saver versus, you know, seam ripping that little bit. And I come up to my seams. At that point, I hand crank. So I've stopped using the foot pedal and I'm just using the hand crank for the last couple stitches until I put the needle right down next to the pin. Beautiful. Out comes the pin, and then I turn my fabric. I'm using the needle from the sewing machine to hold it all in place while I turn it so nothing goes anywhere. And I make sure all my fabric is lined up, and this is very lightweight fabric, so it's moving around quite a bit on me. The other thing that you might have to do at this point is just if your sleeves aren't perfectly exactly the same length, you might have to tug a tiny bit on it. That's also a hack, but it allows those layers to be lined up when you finish sewing this. That's one reason I put those needles at the end. And of course you do the other side pretty much the same way. I'm just showing it here so that you have a sense that it got done. And you can see that that seam line is decently well lined up. I mean, it's not perfect. I can see it's not perfect, but very few people are going to examine my underarm very closely. And I think to most people that's going to look fairly professional. Finishing the edges can be optional. If you have fabric that frays a lot like this one, I really recommend putting a zigzag stitch right inside the edge of the fabric and then trimming off any extra frayed edges that are sticking out. This will ensure that it does not keep fraying. If you didn't do that, then I recommend a double fold hem. This is one of the most common kinds, and it just neatly wraps all of your raw edges inside 2 folds before you sew it down. That first fold I skipped over because it can happen very quickly, but the second fold, I'm showing you how much time I'm taking it. We're not doing it in real time, but you can see that I am measuring it very carefully and very accurately. This does not have to be with a ruler, it just has to be a super consistent fold over, because that's what you're going to need when you go to the sewing machine to sew it. You'll be sewing at the sewing machine from the outside of the garment, so you won't be able to see this interior edge and follow that. You'll be staying as consistently the same distance from the edge of the garment on that outside as you can, and it should be 1/8 of an inch or a tiny bit less than what your distance was that you folded things up. I like blue tape so I can see my seam allowance really easily, and I start underneath the armpit going across that little folded up area first, because there'll be an overlap at the end, and I want that to be the most hidden area. It's also, if there are problems sewing, that's where you're most likely to see them, that and on the inside of the garment rather than the outside. So I'm just being as careful and accurate as I can with my sewing here. And I go all the way around the circle. oh, look, there's my note that this is the front and then I'm looking at the outside of the garment. Hey, it is. I'm so happy about that. Okay, one other thing I want to show you here at the end, and this is just a little bit of a hack, is you can see that I have more fabric on the top of the sleeve than in the back. And I'm compensating for that by pulling the two sides of the fabric a little bit apart from each other. This is me tugging it. I'm now going to overlap after I get under the seam allowance by 1 inch. Now the overlap is not a hack, it's the pulling that is the hack I was showing you. So that's why I put that little wink up there. And here's what we've done. There are no problems with the stitches. And let me show you what it looks like on.
Now my sleeves look great. Who knows where I'll go? Sew them together and look like a pro.